should get started here. I hope you all noticed there were, of course, food and handouts outside. Welcome to New America. I am Michael Calabrese. I direct the Wireless Future project here, which is part of our Open Technology Institute. And this event is on auctioning America's wireless future. You know, who's going to have the spectrum for the next generation of ultra-fast, low-latency networks. And we're particularly talking about the Citizens Broadband Service. Back in April 2015, the FCC voted unanimously 5-0 to adopt the Breakthrough Spectrum Sharing Order. CBRS, the Citizens Band Service, opens a large band of high-quality spectrum for both licensed and unlicensed sharing with U.S. Navy radar operations at 3.5 gigahertz. So this is something new and innovative because until now, spectrum bands have typically been either, you might say, black or white. You know, they've been either exclusively licensed, for example, for cellular services or for television or whatever, or unlicensed, which is bands, of course, that Wi-Fi use. Or they've been allocated for military or other federal users, and those bands are managed by the NTIA, part of the Commerce Department. But CBRS is premised on a unique framework that is designed to make licensed spectrum affordable for a diverse set of localized users and use cases. The proposal for this multi-tiered sharing approach came originally back in 2012 from the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology. Their report focused on opening federal bands for sharing, the reason being that the federal government had the largest amount of spectrum, but often for uses such as radar, such as naval radar off the coast, most of the bandwidth is not in use, at least not in most places or at most times. And the question was, you know, what's the best way? Since all the good spectrum has been assigned to somebody, how do we open bands dynamically for sharing? And so the recommendation was essentially what became the Citizens Broadband Service. The final order was adopted in last year in May 2016, resolving petitions for reconsideration and charging the Wireless Innovation Forum to host a industry multi-stakeholder process that I'm sure you'll hear a bit more about later to hammer out the technical rules, because this is, you know, certainly the most complex approach toward spectrum access that's ever been attempted, since it involves 3 different types of services essentially operating across a band together. So what I figure is, I don't want to chew up too much time, but I should just give you just a quick overview of what the Citizens Broadband Service is, you know, what the framework is, so that then the speakers actually don't have to do that piecemeal. Essentially, we're talking about 150 megahertz of spectrum between 3550 and 3700 megahertz would be shared with incumbents that include Navy radar and also satellite Earth stations that are in the adjacent band and have to be protected as well. So it's a 3-tier spectrum sharing hierarchy. And on that handout, you see that pyramid in the upper right. That pretty much explains it. That's, you know, kind of become the classic description, which is at the top of the pyramid, you have the Navy. You have what's called incumbent access, Navy radar. Then there is a spectrum access system, a geolocation database system that will facilitate sharing along with the sensing system. And that will enable sharing of two flavors. One is priority access licenses, which we'll be probably talking and debating quite a bit, because that's what's sort of at issue right now about what the terms of those priority access licenses will be. Currently, it's the bottom 70 megahertz of the band would be for 7 priority access licenses, each being 10 megahertz. They have 3-year terms, but the initial term can be up to 6 years. It was sort of a start, recognizing a kind of startup time with a new service, new equipment, new deployments, and so the licenses are, that's unusually short terms. It's also not automatically renewable. So at the end of each license term, there's competitive renewal, meaning there would be, if there's contention, in other words, if there's demand for more than 7 licenses in each local area, there would be an auction again. And so there would probably be an auction every 3 years in the future under the current rules. And then another key feature is the license areas are very small by the standards of FCC auctions. They're just census tracts. And census tracts, of course, in a city like New York could be a few square blocks, or they're much bigger, obviously, once you get out into the suburbs and into rural areas, but they're still incredibly small. There are thousands, tens of thousands of census tracts nationwide, whereas FCC licenses are often, like in the TV incentive auction, was based on partial economic areas, which itself was also small by historical standards. The Competitive Carriers Association had pushed for these smaller PEAs, and there's only 416 of them nationwide, so they're multi-county areas. And then finally is general authorized access, which is 80 megahertz of the band. So the band's roughly divided in half. And it's not unlicensed, contrary to what I said earlier. It's licensed by rule. But it's open access. Anybody can use it just like unlicensed, just like Wi-Fi, you might say, except there is a registration requirement. And of course, like the PALs, like the priority access license operators, the GAA users will be subject to control by the database. And so sharing is governed by this geolocation database called the Spectrum Access System. And essentially what it does is devices are required to check frequently and make sure that there's not a Navy ship, for example, pulling up the port, which shouldn't be much of a problem in Iowa, but the majority of the population lives along the coast, and so that's why this is critical. And then coupled with that is a environmental sensing capability. So essentially a network of sensors up and down the coast, all the way around the United States, that would hear the Navy ships approaching the coast and then alert the SAS, which would in turn tell the devices, if necessary, to change channels. And for that reason, something that's also very unusual is that the priority access licenses are not for a specific frequency band. Everything that's been auctioned before has been specifically for a certain piece of the airwaves. But what a PAL entitles you to is 10 megahertz of spectrum with interference protection. But you may have to move. If the Navy ship comes, your device has to be capable of frequency hopping, of automatically switching to another channel in the band. And for that reason, both the licensed and the GAA gear, all the equipment that's certified for the band is required to operate across the entire band. In addition, one last feature, interestingly, which what we pushed heavily for, is that the GAA users, in other words, the kind of quasi-unlicensed use, is permitted on any of the spectrum in the band across the entire 150 megahertz when it's not in use. So for example, if somebody acquires a set of priority access licenses in the New York area, and it takes them 2 years to actually deploy service, during those 2 years, that spectrum's available for open public use on a GAA basis. As soon as they commence service, they notify the SAS notifies the GAA guys, get the heck off their channel. So you're only green-lighted, kind of hour to hour by, for the channels that are not in use by somebody higher up the food chain. So I know that sounds complicated, which is why this WinForm process has spent tens of thousands of hours, probably collectively among all the companies working out all the air interfaces and all the rules. But that's where we stand. So we're going to have 2 panels. This first one is, I think of them as the unusual suspects in a way, because typically when we have these events, it's pretty much who you can expect is always, Verizon, AT&T, Facebook, Google, et cetera, kind of the usual big players in spectrum proceedings. But CBRS is a very different situation because these small license areas and other aspects has really promised to open this up to new uses and new users, and we have many of them represented here. So what I'll do is I'm going to ask an initial question to each of you as a way of, by way of introduction, so I'll remind the audience, but you have their bios. I'm just going to give name, rank, and serial number because you have their bios. And then we'll have some discussion, and then we'll open it up to your questions and comments after each of the panels, and probably just 50 or so minutes or so. Then we'll switch over to the second panel, which will focus more on the regulatory issues specifically. So Michael Fitzpatrick, immediately here on my left, is the head of regulatory advocacy for General Electric here in DC and develops regulatory strategy across all of GE's diverse business groups. Michael, GE, as I was just saying, GE doesn't often file comments on spectrum allocations and rules. So why this time? What sort of innovations and use cases are you expecting that makes this band important to GE's business?
Thank you. Michael, it's great to be here. And you're right, we aren't traditionally in these conversations, although increasingly we are and will be, because spectrum policy is becoming important to every commercial, industrial enterprise in the United States. So let me take, if I could, a quick step back and do a brief commercial on what GE is today, because it's highly relevant to why I'm sitting here next to you today. And then I'm going to talk about some really big picture ideas on why this is such an important policy. And then when we get into the discussion, we can dig down deeper into it. So first of all, General Electric is a large conglomerate. We build, cure, power, move the world. We are a large infrastructure company. Jet engines, locomotives, gas-powered turbines, wind turbines, grid management, healthcare machines, sophisticated healthcare machines, and jet engines. Okay, so we are, in a sense, making the infrastructure for the 21st century globally. What's the big idea is that the fourth industrial revolution is upon us, and it has to do with machine-to-machine communication. It has to do with harnessing the power of big data and predictive analytics to make our world better, safer, more resilient, and more efficient. Okay? It's kind of like in the movie The Graduate, plastics. Well, it's IIoT. That is the future, at least for the next generation. And this policy catalyzes the potential of the industrial internet. So let me speak a little bit about what that is. All of our machines now aren't simply pieces of steel and wire. They are literally supercomputers, and they are throwing off terabytes of information every minute, hour, operation cycle. Okay? A jet engine is throwing off information on 1,000 parameters every second. And that information can be aggregated into vast data lakes in the cloud securely, very securely. And you can mine the data in that lake to create operational efficiency. You can predict malfunction. You can predict accidents. You can improve efficiency and efficacy of operations, and that can yield to huge economic benefits and huge safety benefits. And our customers understand that. We sell them a machine now. We're also selling them the capacity for that machine to operate better into the future and more safely. We sell them actually an outcome, a performance outcome. And that's all enabled by getting this data from the edge to the cloud. And you get from the edge to the cloud increasingly in this spectrum space, okay, because it meets the requirements so perfectly for us and for our customers. Let me give you a couple quick examples. Jet engines, as I said, are spinning off all this information. When that plane lands, you can go up and plug a laptop into the engine, download the information with a human being, then go to another computer and transfer it into the cloud somewhere. Or that plane can be throwing that information into the cloud in real time, okay? If you've got a pipeline that has a SCADA system that's sensing pipeline flows, okay, and there's an emergency situation, you want those, you want the valves to close instantaneously, right? You want that instantaneous communication, that resilient communication to occur. So this is also a question of critical infrastructure. It has implications for the national interest in terms of our safety and national security. It has to do with improving safety of our systems, and it has to do with economic performance. So when we saw this spectrum and this innovative idea being introduced, we were all on board because it provides small geographic units. It provides us and our customers with the opportunity to economically purchase bandwidth that works for our purposes, okay, and they're myriad, as I was saying. And if we were to go to a regime where we would essentially be licensing this, if we were able, from a large cellular carrier, query whether we would be able to, query whether our customers would be able to afford it. It adds a lot of uncertainty and inefficiency into the process. So our view is the spectrum is a precious national resource. This policy supports national interests on so many levels, including helping America win the industrial internet era, the fourth revolution. And any alteration to a policy that seems to be successfully launched and gaining traction appears to us a little bit like a solution in search of a problem. Last point I'll make, this is happening now. This isn't speculative. We are making these devices, these technologies now. We had 10,000 SCADA radios in the field supporting critical infrastructure before this policy went in place, and they were protected by the policy. We're now leveraging this to go to scale way beyond that, and it's happening as we speak. So this isn't some ephemeral future benefit for the country. It's happening right now.
All right. Thanks, Michael. We'll go next to Jill Canfield, who is Vice President and Assistant General Counsel of NTCA, the Rural Broadband Association. So Jill, NTCA represents smaller, typically more rural carriers. Can you tell us a bit about how your ISP members plan to leverage PAL and GAA spectrum, and whether access to the licensed portion of the band will be important for connecting, more rural homes and businesses?
Sure. In order to understand really what our members' interested is in this band, you really have to understand who our members are. So NTCA represents about 850 rural broadband providers. And that's kind of a mix between commercial companies, typically family-owned businesses, and cooperatives, community-owned telcos. And our members serve the most sparsely populated, difficult to serve areas of the country. And they're difficult to serve because of topography, weather, and also just the economics of serving really, really rural areas. There just aren't a lot of people to support a system. Our companies exist mostly because the large companies weren't willing to serve these areas. Now, when you hear a large company, you know, AT&T or Verizon, talk about rural, they're not talking about our rural. Our rural is rural, rural. Our members serve about 40% of the country's land mass, but only about 5% of the subscribers. So all of our members offer broadband, right? They do this to most of their communities. All of them do it through a wireline service, but we also have wireless. Now, when you're serving a ranch that's maybe 1.5 miles from its closest neighbor, and the ranch house is half a mile from the road, it's not economical to get fiber to that ranch, right? So you might use wireless as a solution to get service to that area. To give you sort of context, our members serve an average of 7 subscribers per square mile, and you compare that to a large company that serves 130 subscribers per square mile. So it's a different solution when you're talking about serving a rural community, and they have to be very creative in doing that. Our members also offer a video product. Most of them offer video, and we have some that offer a wireless mobile product as well. The use of spectrum, it's really important to the membership because it can be a very efficient way to get service out. And our members are already doing this, and in order to make it a continued solution for rural communities, the spectrum has to be affordable. And it has to be licensed in a way that covers just the territory the company is willing to serve. So when you put something at auction, our members are competing against an AT&T or Verizon or even T-Mobile, they will not win. They just simply don't have the resources to do that. They have never won, they will not win if they're interested in the same spectrum resource. So it's just, when we're talking now, just merely a year after the FCC issued its latest order on reconsideration, talking about opening this spectrum band completely up to a business plan that really suits just the nation's largest mobile providers. It creates a lot of uncertainty for companies now where they've started with plans and now they're all pulling them back, and has the potential to completely upend what I think is going to be a very useful and creative resource for small companies serving rural communities.
Michael, can I say one thing? This might be one of the only issues ever where multi-billion-dollar commercial, industrial, and infrastructure companies would agree with rural users that they won't win at auction because it doesn't meet the business case, right? So it's a really interesting feature of this. Yes.
Buying an area that's 10 times as big as
or
they
1,000
need,
times bigger than
in
they
your
need.
case, yeah.
Yeah.
So we'll go to Patrick Leary. Patrick is president of BuyCells Technologies North America, a provider of disruptive LTE solutions. So Patrick, tell us a bit about BuyCells and what you are seeing in the marketplace, what sort of use cases you expect to be supporting.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, New America Foundation, and you folks for attending, and those of you online. So at less than 4 years old and over 350 patents and patents pending, BuyCells is what you might call an innovation engine. We were founded specifically wrapped around LTE. We were founded by one of what they call the 12 fellows at Huawei, and specifically the gentleman that built and ran its IPR division, so the one that really put Huawei on the map for LTE. So we participate in everything from narrowband LTE, small cell, indoor and out, and rural broadband. In North America, even though we've only been selling for commercially about less than 1 year, we've got about 300 small operators. Among them are NTCA members. In addition, among them are customers that use GE equipment, some utilities. So I understand from which both of these gentlemen and lady come from on their opinions. There's a bit of serendipity that happened in the past week that really should help inform your opinions and should frame some of our conversation. And I love it when that kind of thing happens, well-timed. One was a piece that came out, I believe it was September 11th of this year, by the GSMA that said there is expected $1.8 trillion in IoT revenue for carriers by 2026. Now, what do you suppose would be the greatest threat to that carrier revenue? And that would be the ability of NTCA members, private network operators, whether they're hospitality, whether they're healthcare, or virtually anyone, because the use cases are as broad as Wi-Fi, of that I guarantee you. So the biggest threat to that revenue comes from the ability of all these other entities to get low-cost priority access licenses so they can build their private networks, and instead of shedding that OpEx to pay a carrier, they can do that in-house. So I would contend that it's the goal of the 4 carriers to drive up the cost of a PAL equal to or greater than the cost of what that operator or entity would otherwise be paying for IoT services. So I think you should pay attention to that metric. Second, a kind of comical bit of news came out just very recently that a lot of people up north received a letter from Verizon, some 8,500 of them, saying that their broadband, they were being canceled as customers because they were using too much of their unlimited data, which is let's just say oxymoronic, right? But that should inform our opinions about what and what is not a broadband provider. So having said that, CBRS was something I've been tracking actually way long before the first NPRM came out in December of 2012. And I am here to tell you this has the potential economic impact equal to or greater than Wi-Fi for a huge amount of reasons. There's a phenomenal amount of spectrum orphans that exist out there, whether it's Lockheed Martin, whether it's someone in the oil patch, whether it's a utility, whether it's a hospital having to deal with HIPAA problems, or a bank doing secure transactions, or hospitality, which has to use Wi-Fi for both guest services and internal operations. So CBRS gives all these entities, for the first time since the development of Wi-Fi, the ability to do what they do in a much better and more secure way, and to do it, potentially, with protected spectrum. It's a phenomenal sort of idea. Only reason all these folks use Wi-Fi today, there's only one reason. Does anyone venture a guess? It's their only choice. So what happens? They have to bolt on all this security infrastructure on top of it. Wi-Fi is a fantastic technology. It's saved carriers bacon, billions of dollars. We all use it every day. But this was not what it was intended for, right? It's intended to be best effort service. So if you're doing critical infrastructure, for example, utilities, and in the US, make no mistake, that is critical infrastructure. Our friends up north in Canada, the Canadians have 1.8 spectrum for utilities. We don't have that opportunity here. Intelligence is being driven to the edge. They need to connect things, and they need to do these things using a standard technology, not some proprietary kind of one-off that binds them to a very small number of vendors, and not with Wi-Fi, which is being shared by all kinds of other devices completely beyond their control. I don't know about you, but if wireless has a role to play in the performance of a jet engine, I fly a lot. I'd prefer that was happening off some other technology other than Wi-Fi. So I would urge that if the rules don't change too much, and I'm supportive of the carriers' arguments, and some of them I can even agree with, especially the right of renewal and maybe some extended term. But if you make the cost prohibitive for kind of the lowest common denominator user to secure a PAL, and I mean maybe someone like Scripps Ranch or whoever it is, then you foreclose on the opportunity of this band to literally transform the telecommunications space.
Thanks, Patrick. Next up, Chris Kimbrough is CBRE's Managing Director for In-Building Solutions within its Telecom Advisory Services Group. So real estate sector here. Chris, high-quality connectivity everywhere is increasingly critical for office complexes and other real estate development. How do you see your clients making use of this new citizens band spectrum, and what sort of use cases do you expect to support?
I'd like to start, just going to start and say I think I'm the most unusual of the unusual suspects up here. So I think I'm going to echo a lot of what's already been said, but also kind of move it down into smaller spaces because for those of you who don't know CBRE, we're the world's largest property management firm, commercial real estate management firm. In the US, we have about 3 billion square feet under management. So we have clients that range, run the gamut, properties that run the gamut from 5,000 square feet up to millions of square feet. We have clients that own one property. We have clients that own many, many, many properties. We work across the gamut. And our focus really is on client service. That is, we're here to deliver world-class solutions to our clients. And the promise of CBRS at the high level for us is this ability to help provision these in-building systems with multi-carriers on them. That's always front of mind when we are looking at our vast portfolio of properties that we have under management, and the increased need for connectivity is how do we get it in the first place. So really, getting CBRS out there is vital for us, vital for our clients. That being said, I think that there are specific use cases that first of all, and we were discussing this earlier in the green room, I don't even think, everybody's talking about innovation in this space, and I don't even think that, and I've said this in other contexts, that we're going to see the breadth of what can be accomplished with CBRS until we see it deployed. And so I think that it would be beneficial to have it deployed as broadly as possible without too many restrictions on who can have access to it. And because when I start to think of use cases within commercial real estate, and commercial real estate isn't really focused on, it's not like everybody's out there chattering about CBRS the way we are. It's not a big focus. It's clearly not on most people's radar. But once it gets on their radar, the use cases that I can see are, in commercial, I focus on multi-tenant office space. I was with 2 clients last week, two of our major clients, and both of them delivered kind of the same message, in the context of broader conversations, which is we're looking for ways to deploy IoT, smart building technology, building automation systems, all in an integrated system that they have, that's secure, that they can, that allows them to better manage, that allows us to better manage their properties for them, and provide these efficiencies that will drive down costs of, and drive down the cost of managing properties and drive down the cost of operating them. So while GE has a very specific use case for doing this, it does replicate itself in smaller contexts across, across multi-tenant office space. Also, we manage across different verticals. We have industrial properties. To varying levels, we also manage hospitality spaces, medical health centers, retail. You name it, we're probably in it. All of those use cases, again, you can see where our industrial clients would have would be very focused on being able to use that IoT functionality within a CBRS-enabled system to make their current industrial facilities function more efficiently. If you look at, provisioning for hospitality, it's becoming more and more of an issue, and it's something that we are trying to. We're trying to help our clients, and right now it's a struggle. So the potential for CBRS to help our clients is, I think, just phenomenal. But it is about getting it out there and allowing the most innovation to take place, because I think until our clients and our managers and our technical people get their hands on it and really have the ability to kind of play with it in real time and real space, that we're not going to see all of the potential of it. And if we curtail it too much on the front end, I think you do have the potential to kill that innovation. And again, 3 billion square feet, there's a lot of room for innovation there if we have, the ability to help service our clients with, the correct level of access for the systems. So.
Thanks, Chris. And Our final introduction is Patrick Dunphy, who is the CIO at Hospitality Technology Next Generation. Patrick, why is the hotel industry interested in this band? Isn't Wi-Fi good enough for you? Because Wi-Fi has obviously become an essential, in fact, some surveys show the essential amenity at hotels, convention centers, even restaurants. So how would the venues you represent make use of small area licenses for LTE? That seems like it's going a step beyond.
Thank you. So the primary use case really focuses around redistributing the macro network inside of the hotel itself. At least historically, hotels have been very underserved and a very small ecosystem of providers with very little innovation over the last 10 to 15 years. And often a 1 to 5 year cycle to get approval from an MNO to deploy an in-building cellular network, which at least currently costs anywhere between $2 and $3 million for a large 500,000 square foot convention space, and obviously quite a bit more as you scale up. So my hope is, with the appropriate regulations and smaller licensing size, that in-building cellular will be deployed like Wi-Fi in the near future. I think we'll always have guest-facing Wi-Fi no matter what we do, because that's at least the status quo for now. Longer term, I think there'll be HVAC, building management systems, and quite a bit more focusing on IoT, hopefully through providers like IBM. So that's the longer term play. But perhaps most important is that we have a healthy ecosystem of suppliers. And if this licensing band is simply available only to people with billions of dollars to spend on spectrum, we're going to lose out and lose out bad. We'll be in the same situation that we are right now with poor in-building cellular coverage, which most of our hotel owners cannot afford for the foreseeable future.
Okay, thanks. Well, let me turn back, maybe initial with a first moderator question to you two at the end, Patrick Dunphy and Chris, probably because Patrick Leary alluded to this, but I think it's good to, I'm kind of interested for particularly like hotels and real estate and maybe some other verticals. Maybe Mike will pitch in again. But why not simply buy these services from mobile carriers? The automakers are increasingly putting cellular connectivity into cars, but they're doing that through AT&T and Verizon. So why don't you just sit back and relax? The big carriers will build out on these bands, and then you can just buy what you need from them, right? I mean,
You're going to guarantee that?
why not?
You're going to guarantee it? Can I get it in writing? I mean, I think that's, I think that we end up in the same situation we're in now, where we're asking the carriers for every single property, for service, and the ability to turn on all 4 carriers at once, as opposed to having to ask each carrier individually for access, is a big differentiator.
So that's a neutral host network
Yeah.
concept?
Yeah.
So major metropolitan areas have much less of an issue than rural areas, so I certainly share your opinion on that. Most rural hotels will never, ever get support from a major network operator to deploy an in-building network. It's just not cost effective for them to provide the backhaul for it, and it's not cost effective for the hotel owner to buy the equipment necessary to do that. So there's a couple of third-party providers that exist in the industry today that fill that gap. There are not that many of them. They all, again, focus on getting MNO approval, and they have a much easier time of it than hotel owners do. But until these networks can be deployed in the space of months and not years, we're not happy with the status quo.
Well, it brings up an interesting point of scale on 2 levels. One, the scale of the property itself is a barrier to getting cellular service into the building. And 2, there are not that many service providers out there that can implement these systems as, in the complex, the way they are now. They're fairly complex systems. They're not easy to design. And so there's, the scale of actually provisioning these systems, of having the resources out there to provision them. Whereas with, the implementation, presumably with CBRS would be more streamlined, and if it's more streamlined, then we can have greater scale of, implementation, and that's going to service everybody, because you can't, right now, it's a struggle, to find the resources to even, get the system built.
And if I could just add on that, when you're talking rural areas, you're also talking IoT in rural areas, where you're talking about connected tractors and farming equipment now, and you may need that connectivity during planting season and harvest season, but not potentially throughout the entire season, the entire growing season, or the fallow season. So to get a large carrier to put a tower to cover a field that the spectrum's only being used a couple times a year, but intensely during that couple times a year, it's just not going to happen. So it makes far more sense to get that spectrum into the hands to someone who really does want to use it.
So let me just, you seem to have touched a point here. So just let me lay out some of the verticals that this has application to, just from GE's perspective. Ports, freight rail lines, hospitals all over America, transmission lines and utility power stations, refineries, the oil fields, so individual well pads and production and distribution facilities out in areas that have more cows than people, okay? Aviation, wind farms. The idea, it's just hard to imagine how added cost, added uncertainty, and by cost I mean real cost and transaction cost, added uncertainty, the perhaps inability to have primacy, because so much of this is critical infrastructure, so you need to have protected, dedicated spectrum, so it's not going to be well served by GAAs, and the potential for interference. That construct doesn't fit with this, and I would flip the question and say, why should we? I mean, the whole point of this policy, in a sense its brilliance, was that it took one piece of spectrum that had heretofore been dedicated to the government, and the government made a policy decision that to benefit the most people, it was called citizens for a reason, to benefit the most people, the most innovation, the most application in America, we were going to try this novel experiment. And the experiment is working. It has the potential to be massively beneficial for the United States of America, to catalyze innovation, to catalyze economic growth, to catalyze social benefit. So as far as I know, I'm not quite sure what's happened since 2015. There may have been one thing that happened, but I guess I'm not sure why the proposition, the merits of the proposition have changed, other than you have companies like GE and others investing millions and millions of dollars in potentially stranded costs to actually carry out innovation in this band. And let me just end with one thought, which will be a topic of the next panel, who I just saw went out to get mic'd up, and that are the regulatory questions surrounding this. So that's my day job at GE, and I think I'm confident that the merits of this policy, the number of stakeholders who see the value in it, will carry the day in the end at the FCC. I think the proposition speaks for itself. Legally, there are some real headwinds and challenges to changing this policy, because it was promulgated through notice and comment rulemaking. It was a unanimous vote by the FCC, which was upheld on a petition for reconsideration. And in order to change or overturn the policy, you have to have a record, an administrative record, that specifically demonstrates why the changes in policy are more compelling than the record that justified the policy in the first place. And so I'm not saying that we're gearing up for litigation or anything like that. I'm just saying, as a policymaker, one of the things you'll look at is, at the end of the road, are we going to be able to defend this in court? And what are the empirical reasons why this policy is changing? What are the changed circumstances that justify modification or revocation? And I would argue, I'm not sure that those are apparent to us, at least.
Yeah, I think I can tell you certainly a couple things that happened. So the report and order on this was actually issued April 17, 2015, not 16. What happened since that period? Since that period, examples, In spring of 2016, both Facebook Live, Twitter Periscope, YouTube's Live, of which we're on right now, all were integrated into their general user platforms, among many other things. So the streaming traffic statistics have gone bam, and the carriers start hitting the panic button, ding, 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 ding. So the opportunity to maybe perhaps lay claim to some of this spectrum, I think, is born partially out of that. And then when they saw the change of administration, they thought, okay, maybe we have an entity a little bit more favorable this time around. But in terms of the other question, why not just carriers? Well, some carriers are doing a specific sort of IoT. And the sort that they are doing now, say, for example, something other than narrowband IoT, requires high-cost terminals, say maybe $10 or $15 terminals, which is price prohibitive if you're trying to drive that intelligence down to something really small, almost the size of something that should be an RFID that could really benefit from being connected. And it's that expensive because it has to talk up to the cell tower, as opposed to talking using some other innovative technology like narrowband LTE, talking a very short range, being able to leverage low power enabling up to 10-year battery life kind of low power, right? So that's one reason. The carrier may not be offering the kind of thing you need. Secondly, the word private networks. Let's not forget the modifier here, private. You know, what's the latest entity that's had their user information hacked? It's not Yahoo this week, or it's them every week, but it's someone else, right? So if you're doing HIPAA stuff or secure transactions or the data mining that's going on now, you really want to throw that on more of a public network? Probably not, right? So the arguments are simple, they're legioned, and I agree with Michael that the premise that this has to evolve to support the carrier need. It's not the carrier need, it's the want. The rest of us have the need. So I reject that the basis of that argument is frankly kind of offensive and ridiculous.
Okay, another contrarian view, you might say, is, you know, besides, you know, why not, we just talked about why not just buy services from the carriers, is the notion that why don't you all just rely on the GAA portion of the band? So as I was saying at the top, you all recall, half the band, a little more than half the band, will be available for general authorized access, which is open to anyone on a best efforts basis, very similar to Wi-Fi on unlicensed. I think Michael here has mentioned critical infrastructure, which suggests one reason, but you know, I guess the question is, do lots of other use cases need interference protection? And then I guess at the same time, you could talk about, like, but can you also leverage the GAA portion of the band at the same time, even if you do need PALs?
Yeah, very simply flip the question and ask the carriers the same question. Why do they want license? Well, it's the same reason we want protection, right? Is our information or use cases any less important than their commercial motive? Absolutely not, right? I think that's very, very simple.
And it's hard to invest in something when you don't have at least some level of protection from interference. It's hard to justify that.
Protection.
And you know, you're using for wireless backhaul, for example, I mean, you can't depend on it if it's not protected from interference. So it matters.
You say critical infrastructure, you mean a very specific thing, but then to your point, like what really is critical? You know, it depends on how you define critical, and if, you know, for our clients, critical may mean something entirely different, but it does rely on having that primacy.
Yeah, well, maybe quality of service is critical to them.
Or
for example.
continuity of service, you know. I can think of a couple of cases where if they had interruptions during the day, it would cost them millions upon millions of dollars.
Have critical functions occurring in your space.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then does the, I mean, something else I think we argued in our filing, our comments, too, was that the use of the GAA portion of the band would also be greatly diminished if there's not an opportunity for all the users like you to have, you know, whether, I don't know how many PALs you would necessarily need. You can only get up to 4 under the current rules, but whether it's 1, 2, 3, 4 for your, you know, to ensure that quality of service or that critical infrastructure. But then what about in terms of leveraging the availability of the GAA? Like, I think that's a great appeal to the carriers too, because if they have 2 or 3 PALs, they also have particularly a first mover advantage to make use of the 80 megahertz of GAA as well.
We'll all leverage the GAA, whether it's for redundancy or whatever. Maybe you reserve the PAL just for your most critical thing, whatever it is, that's your thing. But you can also expect the carriers will use the GAA too, just like they want to use 5 gig for LAA and LTEU, of which people like us build equipment for. So, you know, we don't discount the value of the unlicensed any more than the carriers now do, although they once did, but now it's probably the single piece of spectrum that saves them the highest amount of OpEx or even CapEx. So GAA is important, but I think the rule as it exists strikes a very nice balance between the availability of PALs, the opportunistic use of PALs that aren't deployed, and as well as reserving some GA. In the top 50, that has to stay GA because there's massive amounts of investments already in that space for that band. So I think the rules as they are struck the pretty nice balance.
Mm-hmm. Something else about this particular band that that many folks here may not appreciate, I don't think anyone's mentioned this, is the propagation characteristics. Because, so the commission in the Spectrum Frontier proceeding is making available thousands and thousands of megahertz of very high frequency millimeter wave spectrum, which has trouble going even through glass, for example, let alone trees or walls or anything else. So I don't know if you don't know if the comment is, but can you say something about the propagation of this mid-band spectrum? What difference does that make?
I will just say, given all of the different applications we have, that it's very important to our customers. I mean, this band has characteristics to it that make it particularly useful for the kinds of applications that GE is working on with our many, many different customers.
I would say in rural areas, I'm not going to say that high-band spectrum has no utility, but its utility is certainly extremely limited. You're talking distance, and high-band spectrum is not going to meet the distance requirements.
It's one of the reasons why this is such an interesting piece of spectrum. For those that may not know, this rule essentially, to some degree, harmonizes the U.S. with the rest of the world, who's been using this spectrum both for fixed wireless and for some level of cellular pedestrian kind of mobility for almost 20 years. Whether it's everywhere in Russia and the former Soviet republics, whether it's entire continent of Africa, pretty much, all of South America, Latin America, Central America, Canada, Europe, they've been using this band. This spectrum activity globally harmonizes, and with that comes mass, vendor participation, and everything else. So yeah, it's a very unique piece of spectrum.
We're going to make way for the second panel shortly, but I want to see if we have any questions from the audience for these unusual suspects here. Any questions? And if you do, please identify yourself, of course. Yes? Oh yeah, say it again with the mic.
Are there any build-up requirements for PAL owners, for PAL licenses?
There's no spectrum squatting because the spectrum floats. It's not a specific piece. And if someone hasn't built out their PAL, the truth is you don't know where that PAL might appear anyway on the spectrum chart. So it's available for opportunistic GAA use until such time as a PAL licensee flips on their PAL. And then the spectrum access system then vacates anyone else that would be in the piece of spectrum the SES chose for that PAL.
That's part of the beauty of the spectrum, actually,
Correct.
is you can't have spectrum, or you won't have spectrum warehousing that you do have now, whether it's because the company that holds the spectrum has no use for it in a particular area, or they just don't want someone else to get it, which we do have now.
Yeah, so even if you're holding a license, you're not assigned 10 megahertz until you need it, until you're ready to use it, actually. And that, in turn, until then, the GAA users can use it.
Yeah, it's an interesting part of this band. In fact, if you go to a CBRS Alliance event, you'll see people from all over the world because they're all following this proceeding. It's the way this spectrum is managed using the dynamic nature of the time domain which is the most efficient way to actually manage spectrum, which, by the way, has never really been done in this kind of scale ever in the roughly since 1931 or so history of the FCC. So there's a whole lot at stake here.
Mm-hmm. Follow-up? Go ahead.
One more question here. How do you see roaming between the actual LTE network and the CBRS band?
You may want to say that again.
Yes. How do you vision the roaming between the LTE network today and the CBRS band?
Just as it is in any other band.
So all the devices will have the
I think it's up to the particular operator whether, for example, whether they would enable some other IMSI, which is your unique ID, to attach to your network, and then you would have to have roaming agreements with the other entities. But the process and the technical mechanisms for that are identical to how they would occur today, for the most part.
So if I give you an example of a cable operator, right? They have a wholesale agreement with Verizon, for example, right? And they're also interested in the CBRS band. So they are implementing a reseller-based business model. So how will they be able to roam between the Verizon network and CBRS band?
Yeah, I don't think the guys like Comcast, Time Warner, and Charter will have any problem forming roaming agreements with Verizon and everyone else. There's just so much market potential.
Mm-hmm.
But it's however they would typically negotiate something like that today. I don't see that as any kind of burden, no matter what the rules are.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, and we have someone from Charter on the next panel, so you might even repeat that. All right, well, if there's not any other burning questions, this is a great opportunity to move to our second panel, focusing on the regulatory debate that's currently in front of the FCC. But thank you to all of you. So come on up, Preston, Colleen, and everybody. Also, while they're getting up here, a warm welcome to my friend Dale Hatfield, who's here. The Dean of Spectrum Gurus. Great to see you, Dale. There, the names are on there. Okay, well, we'll start this up right away. So we have here some of the usual suspects, the preeminent players in this debate, certainly right now and even for years since it started. I'll start with Steve Sharkey, who is Vice President for Government Affairs, Technology, and Engineering Policy at T-Mobile, its office here in D.C. So, Steve, I think which I think I even failed to mention, but you can obviously tell us a bit about it. Both your company and CTIA filed petitions asking the Commission to revise the rules for priority access licensing, and T-Mobile's petition goes further, proposing that the entire band be auctioned with those revised rules, which would mean auctioning off the 80 megahertz currently allocated for GAA. Can you explain, I guess, the basic policy rationale behind the petitions?
Yeah, and thanks for inviting me to be here today. And I will say I love the first panel. It was a great panel, and I think when I looked at the participants, I thought you were inviting me just to be beat up on our proposal. But I was actually really surprised by the first panel, because I think the one thing that came out of that is the value of licensed spectrum and the reliability of that, and that there was widespread acceptance that that's what's really required. So, really our proposal came out of our, what we were seeing around the globe, though, of this band being one of the key bands for 5G technology in Asia, Europe, Latin America, around the world, the band is being looked at as a portion of, at least, a key driver of 5G. So we felt we were really missing an opportunity to be a leader in taking advantage of 5G technology here in the U.S. with the current structure, because the current structure really does have uncertainty around deployment. The short license terms, lack of renewability, and the limited amount of spectrum for licensed services really undermine the value and I think the investment. So, our petition, kind of probably the biggest parts of that are that the entire band should be licensed. There should be 10-year license terms with a renewal expectancy, and that they should be on larger areas, PEAs rather than the census blocks. What we don't do is propose to get rid of the three-tier structure. Our proposal would maintain that so that GAA use would be there on an opportunistic basis. You would still have the SAS managing use of spectrum. And if a PAL licensee doesn't build out or isn't currently using the spectrum, GAA use would be free to use it. I think after listening to the first panel and the value of licensed spectrum, it's actually surprising that when I read the comments that there seems to be a lot of opposition to what we've proposed on licensing across the entire band. Because one of the main points there was the desire to compete against carriers for licenses. Frankly, the more licenses you have, the lower the prices will be, the more opportunity there is for companies to get hold of that. The current rules limit you to 4 PAL blocks, which we think is fine. But under the current structure, with a maximum of 7 PALs, that's 2 licensees. And so if you're competing for such a limited number of licenses, the companies that we just heard speak, if they thought they would have, if they think it's hard to compete, it's going to be much harder to compete for 7 licenses as opposed to 15. But I guess all in there, that's really our, the intent is really to position the U.S. To compete as effectively as possible for deployment of 5G services, to really structure this band in a way that attracts investment and drives technology innovation and makes it a leading technology while not losing kind of the key characteristics and innovation of the approach with the SAS and the overall 3-tier structure.
Okay. Thanks, Steve. To introduce next Colleen King, who is Vice President for Regulatory Affairs at Charter Communications and is responsible for federal regulatory, particularly on wireless and public safety issues. So Colleen, Charter's Spectrum Internet service offers mobile connectivity over Wi-Fi primarily. How would the CBRS band support your wireless offerings, and what's Charter's position on changing the rules for PALs?
Michael, first of all, thanks for having us. Charter's very excited about CBRS band. Also on a personal level, thank you for inviting me to be on a panel. My husband's a comic book writer, so as part of that, he's on panels all the time at these comic conventions. So my kids thought it was pretty cool that I was going to be on a panel today. Unfortunately, Captain Don't Change the Rules Too Much doesn't compete well with Batman, but I got the panel at least, so I'm moving up in the world. But as you mentioned, Charter is already in the wireless business. We have over 200 million wireless devices, but as we've also publicly announced, we are moving forward, transitioning from a Wi-Fi only to full mobility network. And so first, we're going to take our wireless infrastructure kind of from an inside out, looking at inside the home first, and then opportunistically kind of outdoor where we can do that. First, in 2018, we've entered into an MVNO with Verizon. We're going to use their network to enhance our Wi-Fi service. But the next big step is spectrum. And so we are excited about the spectrum opportunities. And the 3.5 band is really interesting to us. Cable is really well positioned to deploy quickly in this band. with our existing plant, we have power, backhaul, and location that were already there. So deploying small cells, we're really well positioned to do that quickly and really quickly improve service for our customers. So in looking at the 3.5 band and the rules, we do like the rules, and we also like the idea to quickly deploy these rules. So any type of changes to the rules that are going to slow down that deployment, we would not be in favor of. We think that the sharing network tier that was created is good. We're also open to some tweaks, but we think that when you make any tweaks to the rules, we have to be careful that you don't, that sharing network that sharing tier are still there, that we still can use both GAA and PALs, and that any changes to the rules don't disrupt the ability to use GAA. We think GAA is a great way to kind of legitimize a business case for going into the spectrum. And so if you have rules that make it really hard to use GAA, that's going to disrupt the whole purpose of this band, which was to bring innovation and new entrants into the marketplace. As I mentioned, we are open to some small tweaks on looking at slightly bigger sizes, but we think PEAs are too big. And then looking at slightly larger license terms, we'd be open to discussing that as well.
Okay, thanks. So next, Steve Coran is the FCC counsel to WISPA, the Wireless Internet Service Providers Association, and the chairman of Lerman Center's Broadband Practice Group, his law firm here in DC. So Steve, the record indicates that dozens of WISPs filed comments in opposition to the T-Mobile and CTIA petitions. Can you explain why smaller wireless operators, such as your members, prefer the framework and licensing rules that the FCC finalized last year?
Well, sure, there are a lot of reasons, but first of all, thanks for having me here, and thanks for all of you guys for coming and streaming. Let me start with a couple of things. First of all, we have a rural broadband problem here in the U.S., and that is that there's 23.4 million people who live in rural areas that are not getting access to broadband right now. And CBRS offers the best opportunity to use spectrum as infrastructure, that was referred to in the first panel as well, spectrum as infrastructure to serve those folks. We have people right now operating in the 3650 to 3700 megahertz band. There's 60,000 or more registered sites. And through a flip of a switch and a software upgrade, they can easily migrate into the CBRS band and get the additional, one, get the additional bandwidth, and two, get the additional protection of priority access licenses if they so choose. And our job was to sort of create options. If they wanted to do GAA, they could do GAA. If they wanted to do PALs, they could do PALs. And the attraction of this is really kind of two things. One is area. Our members serve rural areas, much like NTCA's members that Jill talked about. And these are very sort of community-based businesses, privately funded. And the folks here really want to serve their communities. And having to buy areas that are much larger than they really want to serve and are really positioned to serve is not a winning proposition for them. The second one is the term. The rules offer right now kind of a pay-as-you-go type of scenario where every 3 years you can re-up. And there's also other things in the record that we might want to talk about a little bit later that suggest that there may be ways for incumbents to get some sort of a preferred right at subsequent auctions for PALs. So the idea of a pay-as-you-go reduces the upfront investment. And what folks should be investing in is deployment, not buying spectrum. But it would be nice to have the protection and the options of this sort of thing. So bottom line is it's low barriers to entry, and it's great spectrum and licensed spectrum for the first time that rural communities can get. And we don't think that rural America should be shut out from having access to licensed spectrum and be able to deploy fixed wireless services in areas that are lacking that service.
Okay. Thanks, Steve. And finally, I'd like to introduce Preston Marshall, who is an engineering director and principal wireless architect for Alphabet Access, where he is responsible for developing spectrum access technologies and also the author of a new book whose title is too long for me to remember.
Thank you, Michael.
Hold that up for the camera.
You can
Show the
look at
people on the
cover
live
of Fierce
webcast.
Wireless. Thanks very much for having me, and thanks for coming. Sort of discussing this is tough to fit into a 2 or 3 minute discussion, particularly after I follow Steve. But we have to go back and think a little bit about why did we incept this band. It was to create a couple features, to put a wide variety of different classes of users on an even spectrum and even standing going into the spectrum. The last panel showed, I think, the kind of enterprises that are imagining innovating in this band. And that's only possible because we allow, for the first time, cellular and people who would otherwise be unlicensed to coexist. So a handset that might be sold in a Verizon store can work on an enterprise network, that a roaming agreement that was between carriers can roam with all the features of LTE and security and such on an enterprise, so the IoT community can make use of the volume of a non-proprietary technology. And that was hinged on this balance between licensed and unlicensed. I'm glad, everyone supported licensed. I'm glad, because if you go back to PCAS, a lot of people thought having any exclusive or any protection at all was a bad idea. And so PCAS said, let's give people the choice of both. We think about competition among companies. What that allowed was a competition between spectrum models. If you thought protection was really important, you could buy it. If you were really innovative and clever, you could not buy it and use that money for building better equipment. So we really competed spectrum models. If we look at and the second thing we did is we pick a band that was intrinsically local. What we did in 3 tiers might not make sense at 600 or 700 megahertz. It goes a long way. It's a good coverage band. But this is a 3.5 band. The energy from this band, if it went through this floor between we're 9th, so it's 8th below us, 100,000th of the energy you radiate up here gets down to that floor, over 50 dB loss. This is a very localized band. Therefore, the framework was set up to have very localized licensing, a single building, a single refinery. We're very active at looking at sports venues, a single sports venue. FCC, we thought, actually went too large with census tracts because there are 4,000 people. They're bigger than an NFL stadium. If you increase the size of what you offer in the market, you increase, obviously, the cost. And you've essentially said the only people who can buy that are those who can monetize it against a large area coverage. And so that's really the question. How do we match how people will monetize the spectrum? And we heard Chris here talk about a building. We saw GE talk about a refinery, an industrial plant. That's the scope of their monetization. We've always felt that the important thing to create a dynamic market that maximizes the opportunity was to match monetization against the size of spectrum. Carriers monetize against a very large area. But the people who are interested in this band, or a lot of them, monetize against small areas. You can always buy more, but you can't buy less. And so by going at census tract, we provide the ability to buy a small block, or for carriers to buy a large one. Steve made the comment that their proposal offers more auctions and more chances for licenses. It doubles the number of licenses. But it divides by factors of almost 1,000 the number of blocks that can be bought. So it's reducing the number of licenses by the hundreds. So yes, more licenses are good. That's a totally correct statement. But what we actually do in going in these large areas is make them actually reduced by hundreds. Secondly, as we extend that license, what we do is we look for people with stable revenues and stable businesses. Stable businesses generally mean they're the ones that 10 years from now we'll never hear about. The exciting ones are the ones who only have enough money to operate for the next 2 or 3 years. The next Google, the next Facebook, the next whatever. I don't know what it is. Someone can tell me and I'll buy their stock. But we want to find these people who have a small amount of money. They've got a great idea. Now, if I put them up against someone buying essentially perpetual rights, what is the chance that we're going to see those companies enter this ecosystem? I won't answer it. You can answer it for yourself. So that's really the challenge. Who do we want in this spectrum? Do we want to create an opportunity for a new kind of service, like the first panel talk? Highly localized, highly specialized, getting the kind of LTE indoors that you're used to outdoors, and use it as an engine of innovation. The FCC called this the innovation band. The support to PCAS largely came out of the Council of Economic Advisors because they saw it as an engine of innovation, like Wi-Fi became. If we were the first to have this, we would then have a very, very significant impact on the international market. And if you look at Wi-Fi, those are US brands largely. So we have to go and think about this not in terms of what's best for one user community, but to think about, too, what are the new user communities who historically haven't entered here, like Charter, like GE, like CBRS. Ever heard a real estate company file on a spectrum issue? So that should tell us something that we've succeeded in these current rules in reaching out for new sources of capital, because our goal ultimately should be to see as many people deploy broadband as we can. And so when we have a whole panel of people saying we want to deploy broadband, if the rules don't change and block us, that's a deal we should all accept.
Okay. And actually, Preston mentioning the localized uses and sports stadiums reminds me, I should have on the first panel mentioned what I thought was the coolest demo that I've seen for CBRS, which was NASCAR, which Preston, I think, helped organize with Nokia and Qualcomm.
Yeah, Nokia and
involved.
Qualcomm. We did another one that, of course, we can't say what it is.
Okay.
But
this
once
was
we get the video.
This was putting a 360-degree camera in the cockpit of a race car.
Of a race car, a stock
Was
car.
Richard Petty driving?
Richard Petty made the cars available to us. We did it at Las Vegas. Such a deployment would very likely be impossible if someone bought up all of the 150 megahertz in a PAL, and a single racetrack certainly couldn't compete against a carrier to buy perpetual rights over a entire PEA. So that's an example of what we would lose. So everything's about opportunity cost. And those are the kind of opportunities we would lose. 360, you can actually sit and have 360 immersive VR. It feels kind of freaky as you go up against the wall really fast.
Well, what I liked was when I could use my mouse to look out any of the windows.
Yeah, I mean, you're looking around everywhere.
I could see more than Petty could because he
the
has to watch
driver
the road.
has this. Yeah.
I was a passenger, but it was very cool to look at other cars, look at people in the stands, look, and it's all in high def.
You can turn around. In one race we did, the car was tapped and spun. You could actually go back, replay, and this time you looked out the rear window, and you could see the car come up and hit him. Well, there was no camera looking there, but because it was immersive. And it's an example. I don't think we scratched the surface of cool things, but I think we have a very good chance of suppressing all of that if we make this just another carrier band, which essentially is what's on the table.
So can I jump in on that?
Yeah,
It's only fair. I agree.
It's a fiction that you're just giving that up if you license the entire band. And you can, we can talk about license size and what's the rest, if PAs are not the right license size, what's the right license size. But, to think that none of that happens if carriers buy spectrum or that nobody can compete against a carrier for spectrum is just fictional. I mean, to throw out Charter as a poor entity that may not enter the market if they have to buy licenses is a little absurd. And frankly, for Google to be saying that that some of the innovation that's going on is difficult.
I think it's one thing to say for a band that was essentially a coverage band, which has largely been addressed by existing ecosystem. Your own argument is this is a 5G band. You couldn't walk through Mobile World Congress without seeing 5G and everything. So I think 5G spectrum does create more excitement than coverage spectrum. So I think it's a different market when we think about what happens in 3.5 than what happened in 600.
Well, I think we would look at this as a balance of coverage and capacity band. But I think what it does, the more interest that you have, the more investment there is in new technologies and developing new technologies and new applications that everybody benefits from. And I think there's plenty of room for innovation and frankly competition in this spectrum. And hopefully we end up with actually a much larger pool of mid-band spectrum than just this, right? As the FCC looks at its mid-band NOI and will grow out from this. And I think there's plenty of opportunity for that. I think with these, with very small license areas, what you do risk is having the spectrum not be as fully utilized by having to coordinate at borders and limitations on power levels that are there, which would benefit from being increased, from rules that make it more difficult to aggregate spectrum and get broader bandwidths. So some of those things get easier as you, as you expand the license size. And
They definitely get easier. They look like how we build systems today. And I think most people, as they watch unlimited plans, as was mentioned, unlimited plans becoming not limited, realize that to some extent the way we build networks today isn't keeping up with the way we are using bandwidth today, particularly indoors. And I think our particular excitement in this band is the indoor case where we know there's very large amounts of attenuation in the walls and such, and people can build a lot in GAA if they're not encumbered by having an overarching PAL. If you auction up all 15, it's perpetual rights. It will be sold, and essentially in large parts of the country. In the areas where there's lots of opportunity for indoors, we'll actually see the suppression of indoors. We'll be working away from the problem we need to solve. Your own CEO got up, and talked about how indoors should be the building owner's problem. Here's an opportunity for building owners to actually step up to that problem, and we'd be suppressing that.
So let me take.
Let me just correct on my CEO, because I think we are always trying to get better access indoor and to get onto DAS systems that are deployed indoors. So I think there's plenty of opportunity for promoting indoor coverage here and working with building owners. But
build it, and then their customers pay someone else to use it. I think I saw Ed Chen at Mobile World Congress actually introduced the idea that Verizon was open to neutral host, and he put up interestingly a chart of a hospital saying it's private LTE in that hospital. They have a chart where they have 3 types of spectrum. So, I think it's not, this isn't the sort of carriers and non-carriers. I think, some of the carrier community starts to see the virtue in a more synergistic relationship with indoors that is a little more balanced than DAS, that creates monetization opportunities, and a lot of features of this ecosystem that was designed in that are potentially compromised. We've seen the amount of interest from non-carriers that's emerged. We had SRO at Mobile World Congress, and Mike did really well on panel 1 here.
On that indoor issue, could this be, maybe I'm overly optimistic, but could this be something like Wi-Fi, where, most people don't even realize, when you're on your smartphone, the majority of the data is not touching carrier spectrum or carrier infrastructure. It's going using Wi-Fi to send it a short distance over unlicensed airwaves into the local wireline connection. Whether you're at, certainly almost all the time, probably you're at work, at home, Starbucks, airports, whatever, which seems to be a benefit to the carriers in the sense that you're buying the subscription, you're thinking, wow, this device is great because I'm getting all this bandwidth and I'm only paying so much. And I'm wondering if that isn't also true for indoor. If there's neutral host LTE networks inside everywhere, for example, or inside a lot of important high traffic places, and it serves as an amenity for the customers of every carrier, not just AT&T and Verizon, but T-Mobile and Sprint, doesn't that increase the value of that subscription to the smartphone?
And we would love that, right? We struggle to get into buildings, right? And a lot of times we're expected to pay very high fees for getting into those buildings, onto those hosted networks. So, neutral hosts that provide reasonable access would be a great thing.
But can they do that?
Neutral host it was always from PCAS sort of the killer app. Get new sources of capital, because you guys have spent a lot on spectrum and a lot on equipment builds. New sources of capital, monetize it. The problem with Wi-Fi is if you follow the incentives, everybody wants to put a Wi-Fi sticker on the door, but they don't benefit if they go from 1 gig to 10 gig backhaul. They don't benefit if they increase the density of the devices. So what neutral host brings into it is that the building owner or the startup benefits from bandwidth. So they have an incentive to deploy not just enough to put the Wi-Fi sticker on the door, but to create meaningful amounts of bandwidth. We would like to see people doing virtual reality. There's a lot of very, very powerful apps that are in the pipeline that are going to be bandwidth constrained. And so in creating an incentive structure where the building benefits financially from building the economics of going from 1 to 10 gig is the advantage of neutral host over DAS. And so, keeping that opportunity for lots of neutral host deployment. seems like something that helps the carriers deploy cheaper. And from our point of view in Google, we want abundant bandwidth. Whoever provides that bandwidth and incentivizes it. Charter, same way.
So are these priority access licenses, are they important for neutral host networks? Or can they just rely strictly on GAA?
So the carriers have all gotten behind LAA. LAA is a mix. We're incentivizing people to be clever. It's easy to just hide behind protection. It's cheap to do it like Wi-Fi. We know the limits of both. LAA, and I think you guys, Steve's company is fully supportive, mixes the two. Keeping a piece GAA is essentially replicating the GAA ecosystem in this band. And so if you pushed LAA or you pushed LTEU, it seems like you're honor bound to see the benefit of an open GAA ecosystem that isn't put up for auction.
So I think the challenge we have here, though, is that it's a relatively small amount of spectrum, right, with 150 megahertz that we're dividing up into a bunch of different buckets. That isn't going to be the most efficient use of this spectrum. So, yes, we're fully supportive of LAA and are deploying it, and that should be a technology going forward in these bands. And I think the opportunity, we're talking kind of just about the 3.5 gigahertz band here, but if we look at the bigger picture of what's going on with the mid-band proceeding that the FCC has started, where we really do have an opportunity to look at a big swath of spectrum that could be used primarily for licensed services, and then another big swath of spectrum that would be unlicensed and result in very efficient use of both of those that would be complementary.
So I think we see the virtue not in two swaths, but one swath where both get use of. And I think the attractiveness of this band is, why is Wi-Fi so popular? It was a lingua franca that both cell phones could get to and devices and anyone could deploy. And so having bands that are accessible by multiple communities, not partitioning the communities, but multiple communities into one band creates that diversity of supplier that ultimately can drive the innovation.
And that's why we keep the three-tier structure in place in our proposal.
So how about for WISPs and cable?
I feel like I'm playing doubles tennis here, and my partner's at the net, and he and Steve are just hitting the ball
You're
back and
sitting in
forth,
the middle of the ping pong table.
Right, exactly.
But, so for WISPs and cable, for example, is this, how do you think about this balance between PALs that are available? Do you need those and GAA working together? I mean, how do you think about it?
I think about it in these terms. I look back historically at the way that larger geographic areas that are not density-based or population-based necessarily are allocated, and the way that they are, and the way that carriers have deployed on that spectrum. And I don't want to see a repeat of where Los Angeles County or the Los Angeles PEA gets built out and you have 5G in Los Angeles, and you still have people that live 50 miles outside the city or 100 miles outside of the city in Los Angeles County still can't get broadband in their homes. And that, for me, is the biggest thing that we want to accomplish here. And I look at what the FCC created. I'll come to your question in just a second, but I'm just sort of building a little. I want to build up a little momentum here. It was pent-up responses for pent-up demand for responding. So what the FCC created was sort of an innovation bed for everybody, but it also created an opportunity for you to have different kind of uses like virtual reality and neutral hosts in urban areas, but also created an opportunity for rural areas. And the proposals that are on the table from the mobile community would essentially create a zero-sum game where it becomes a 5G band that is controlled by the existing carriers, and there isn't room, and even if there is room, it won't get built out. And opportunistic use is not a viable alternative without sort of allocated GAA channels to fall back on, because it's just not going to drive the economy, and it's not going to drive the innovation that's going to bring that sort of thing in this very nice band to serve those unserved homes.
Yeah, I mean, when you talk about Wi-Fi and spectrum putting that together, that's exactly what Charter is doing. We're testing right now. We're looking at kind of the use cases based on the testing. We're testing mobile in various markets. We're testing fixed, and I think looking at both inside and outside, and in particular on some of the fixed testing, kind of what can you do into the rural areas and how could we get into that using the spectrum. But we already have a great network out there using Wi-Fi. This is the perfect opportunity for us to use this. which is why it's important, I think, to have both PALs and GAA. We do want to be licensees in the band, but it's also important to have GAA. There's not always a business, you need to make sure that there is the business case there to do it, which GAA is a great reason to do that. So we think that the balanced policy that was created by these rules shouldn't be disrupted by making rules that really look like a traditionally wireless band, which makes it perfect for the carriers, but not necessarily for other new entrants.
And just to put Colleen on the spot, before we get off the areas, the geographic size of these licenses, Charter in its comments suggested that there might be grounds for compromise. The difference between, somebody on the previous panel said it was like a factor of 1,000 perhaps, not 1,000, but factor several hundred, the difference in size between a partial economic area, of which there's only, I believe, 416 nationwide, and a census tract, which particularly in cities can be incredibly localized. So I think in your comments you said you were, unlike many of the rest of us, that you were open to a middle ground. So I don't know if you talk a bit about that, because there also comes, at what point does it get unaffordable for?
Right. No, and it's a good question. And we propose counties, which I think we're definitely open to still talking. We think that PAs are way too big for many of the reasons everybody here, these people handle discussing that.
Mm-hmm.
Census tracts are a little difficult operationally, particularly for a cable company who, a lot of our plant runs down the sides of streets, and I understand census tracts kind of tend to run down the middle of a street. So there's reasons to look operationally at it if there's something a little bit bigger than a census tract. But getting too big it comes with all the reasons that we wouldn't want us to be a traditionally wireless band. So we're definitely open to compromise if there's some kind of middle ground. Counties was one thought. I know there's...
What was that?
Counties was our thought that we proposed to see how others would react to that. We think that in certain areas counties would be great. I know others people have suggested those are still too big. But we would, I think finding a middle ground approach we'd be happy with.
Is there any other middle ground ideas? Is there anything between counties and census tracts that would be worth?
Middle ground, we're still too big, because I look at CBRE back there when Chris talks, and she's thinking about buildings.
Yeah.
This would be helped a bit if we had more flexibility in using scatter losses, where we could recognize. Right now, the rules, even the wind farm ones that were kind of the lowest common denominator, sort of do interference analysis somewhere before the American Indians came across the Bering Sea, before we built buildings, using just terrain. And in fact, for most of the places that are interesting to deploy, it's about buildings. So if we had the rules updated to reflect more of use of geodata, then we could be more comfortable. But right now, when we're using Longley Rice, which is just the natural terrain, it makes Manhattan look like an unoccupied piece of forest. It's still a fairly large keep-out zone for PALs, and so that drives us towards seeing smaller and smaller areas as more enabling of some of these use cases.
So can I agree with Steve for a second?
Oh, okay, go ahead.
So, you did mention that there's other spectrum in play on the midband, and there's a lot of variables in what we're talking about here in terms of term, in terms of geographic area, in terms of renewability, and those are conversations that maybe we all should have, because if you kind of limit it, it becomes much more difficult to negotiate, and it becomes much more difficult to achieve kind of results that everybody can live with. We haven't even talked about things like, should we have different sizes in urban areas versus rural areas? We haven't talked about things like, maybe you should have some PALs that are longer terms than others. So there's a lot of different things that we can do, but we all need to sort of have that discussion behind closed doors, but have it holistically. And I think that would be a good out-of-the-box way to try to cut through some of this.
And I was going to throw in at the end of what Preston said, just for the sake of wonkery, that...
Wonkery?
Wonkery. You? Wonkery?
That's not really wonkery.
Is that the PCAST proposal originally was for not to use standardized geographic areas for interference protection, but to simply protect based on deployment. So you deploy, you tell the SAS what you deployed, and they would give you a certain interference protection perimeter, you might say. And the idea was that then you could really squeeze as much use as possible in and do that on a dynamic basis. But the FCC could not wrap their heads around the idea of an auction that was not selling standardized geographic units. And we argued with them a lot about how small can we go. And their conclusion...
Unsuccessfully, we argued.
Yes, right. And the conclusion was census tracts.
Which looked terrifically big 2 years ago.
Right. and which now seem, Steve and others believe they're way too small. But one argument, it's interesting that the commission brushed aside 2 years ago, which has come up again, and I just wanted to mention this in case any of you have an opinion, is the idea that it's actually even, forget about what's good policy or not, it's just infeasible. The FCC can't possibly manage an auction with 60,000 units, up for sale, and do this every, 3 years. That it's just too complex to have census tracts times seven licenses at a census tract level, which is, I think, something like 60,000 units total. But Paul Milgram, the Stanford economist who was the lead in designing the TV incentive auction, just did a filing saying, no, that's, kind of crazy. I don't know, Steve, if you want to,
Sure.
You've spoken to Milgram about it
Right.
and supported some of his work, so.
So he's putting another fuller paper out later this week, or later this month, that gets into other things. But the two things that he focused on in the paper he submitted to the FCC were, one, it's not too complicated to conduct this sort of an auction because it doesn't have some of the things that traditional spectrum auctions have had, which is things like complementary use and substitution. There wouldn't be a lot of switching when you have dynamic spectrum access. The SAS does that for you. You could also go to a simpler auction design. The FCC has used, the very first auction they did, which I hope we never do again, was an oral outcry auction. We're not going to do that, but we could do single round. We could do, single round bidding with sealed bid. There's a lot of different auction designs the FCC could adopt, and I'm not here to say which one, I would prefer at the moment. The second thing he pointed out was a way to sort of overcome the problem, if it is a problem, of being able to invest in a short-term license. And the idea here is that every 3 years there would be an auction. Maybe it'd be conducted by the commission, maybe it'd be conducted by some other exchange, where the incumbent licensee would have some sort of a foothold. So I would get, if it were me, I would get a preference if I bid lower than Preston here, just because I've had the license. And that's one of his ideas. His other idea is the idea of a depreciating license, where you set a price for your license way up here, and or wherever you want it to be. You pay a certain fee in exchange that's related to that price. But if somebody comes along and offers you that price, you have to sell them that license. And I think if we want to get into that for this proceeding, then it'll be a long time before we see CBRS actually become a reality beyond the experimental stage. But it is an interesting thought for future auctions for those who sort of get into game theory.
Well, and I think there are lots of different approaches to adding certainty or new licensing, and we wouldn't foreclose any of those. I think the key is that there's enough certainty around getting the license that it does drive that investment and use. And I think it's actually, it's interesting because it's, I think, been pretty common theme throughout all the speakers that the value of having certainty is real, as opposed to some just unlicensed model. And just on the the PCAST idea of that, in your phrasing, that it would pack as much in as possible to not have these license areas. I mean, the other outcome there would be you could end up with small islands throughout that are broken up, and you've got interference protection that actually limits the efficient use overall of this spectrum, which is the way we see it. That if we've got the flexibility to control a larger area, we can deploy it over that area as efficiently as possible, rather than...
Is that the idea that you can coordinate with yourself easier than with others?
Yes.
I think we addressed that early in the filing process, and arguing that the SAS would be dynamic and always try to maintain contiguous. So if it happened to be that AT&T went in and then T-Mobile went in, and then T-Mobile wanted to come right next to it, we wouldn't leave them as neighbors. We would move the AT&T. For the first time, we can move people around the spectrum, so we don't get this blocking that we get today. So we would just move the AT&T, give, and essentially start to allow people to build
Right,
out
so
continuity.
you use us as examples of that on a more traditional deployment, though, right? So now if you're talking about every building owner having some different system and having to then coordinate amongst those, it gets more difficult.
So I
right?
think
And
we've done, one of the things we set as one of the objectives of CBRS Alliance, of both WindForum and CBRS Alliance, WindForum technology neutral between us, say, and the WISPs, and non-LTE using WISPs, and then within CBRS Alliance is a set of agreements that look very much like how a carrier manages its interference and agreements on time and all. One of the virtues of building a band whose rule structure was very friendly to LTE was the fact that LTE has all of these features to put networks together, to put them sharing spectrum, reuse one. You guys have made great use of it and all. And so the framework is to extend among a homogeneous deployment, those techniques, into more heterogeneous ones. And we think that's something that with the right industry standards could have been accommodated. Clearly, the PCAS was influenced by its co-chairman, which is Eric Schmidt, and but he was thinking that, gee, Google runs 2 million, I've forgotten the exact number, but I think it was quoted in the papers like 2 million a minute auctions for placing those ads. And so running for probably a 4-month process, a mere 500,000 doesn't seem like a technologic burden, certainly.
So I'm going to open the floor just 1 minute for questions, so think about it, but I wanted to cover the other contentious issue just quickly, if, with hopefully some crisp
Only
answers.
one other contentious
Well, the other most contentious issue, which is, and you all have commented on it a little bit already, but renewal. Whether there should be competitive renewal, which we've never had, or just, in a sense, automatic renewal after, well, the proposal is 10-year licenses that renew over and over again unless you have, well, and that's the question is, I don't believe that either CTIA or T-Mobile proposed build-out requirements, which are typically, associated with automatic renewal.
we did say that there should be some build-out requirements here, although there are different ways to do it. I think, like Steve said, you could always have, pay if you don't build out, or pay some prorated amount if you don't pay out, right? There's, I think, creative ways to do it rather than having, because one of the challenges here is how do you define build-out requirements and what are the right build-out requirements. But I think there are actually creative ways to do it a little bit differently than we've done it before. But we did say that there should be some penalty if you don't use it, or some, some requirement to use it. And obviously, we do keep the 3-tier structure in place, so if somebody's not using it, and it's free to be used by GAA in the meantime.
But the problem you have, I think, with that is sort of the policy question of how do you have use it or share it with build-out requirements and renewal expectancies, and trying to put all those together under one roof. Because if you think about it, use it or share it, or the opportunistic use, is kind of the antithesis of build-out and kind of the antithesis of renewal expectancy. So if you have thousands and thousands of licenses, or hundreds and hundreds of licenses, depending on where we end up, or somewhere in between, let's just use thousands as our metric. Is the FCC staff really going to want to look at all those renewal showings and build-out requirements when it has a use it or share it? So renewal expectancy, to our view, unless it has some teeth behind it, and I don't know how you do it, it's really just sort of becomes a perpetual license, and that's the sort of thing that we kind of dislike intensely about the proposal that the mobile community has advanced.
What would build-out mean for Los Angeles
Right.
County? You deployed in one little piece, but you
And
precluded anyone else from having the certainty of a PAL license because you built out one neighborhood, but LA County, I don't know how big
And
is
the
how many
solution- the
hundred
solution
square
where you
miles.
give-
Okay,
And
so
the
but
solution where you give back spectrum after you have 8 years to build it out, and you give it back, is not really a solution, because we all know what areas are going to be given back. They're going to be the rural areas that are not that don't give you the ROI that your company needs, but it's also the areas where people need broadband
So I
in their
just
homes.
like to say, we have two problems with renewal. One is it really means that we've locked not only, so we may not lock technologies in, but we've locked business models in. And so we don't have the ability of new business models to come in. Let's forget individual companies. And two, it raises the price, which blocks out those innovators. Because if I'm bidding for something that goes for all time, that never depreciates against my balance sheet, I have a very different view of it than if I'm bidding against something that in the end of 4 years goes up for competition. I warehouse the right to be protected rather than warehousing the use of spectrum. But they raise the price. They become barriers to the innovation that otherwise drives the economy. Why is wireless sort of set like it is? Well, the internet goes off with totally reinventing itself, creation of new companies and all. It's because there's no barriers to entry.
Well, there's plenty of innovation in the wireless space, both by carriers and new companies that are building equipment to go on networks or compete. Without the renewal expectancy, you undermine. We spend billions of dollars a year on infrastructure deployment, and that's what you undermine. Is if that's all going to go away within 3 years, what's our motivation for deploying it? And I'm a little. I mean, WISPs run into this all the time, right? How many times have we heard WISPs that deploy on unlicensed spectrum, and when somebody else comes in to use that spectrum, they complain because they've already made this investment, have a business up that customers depend on, and now want to protect that unlicensed spectrum that they got for free and deployed from anybody else coming in. So I think that the fiction that just because it's unlicensed, there's no barrier. Companies are trying to put up those barriers all the time.
So
and in fact, the LTU LAA fight was a prime example of that, where Wi-Fi is widely deployed in unlicensed bands, but yet the rules allow deployment of any technology. And as soon as we brought in a technology that they felt was going to be widely deployed, they tried to put up regulatory barriers to block that, and blocked it for years until we were finally able to overcome that.
So Steve, I think the PCAST report, I don't think it recommended a period of years. What it argued was that licenses should match capital recovery. And so, and it's very much in the PCAST model was thinking indoor, where you were modifying enterprise deployments, which are typically 3-year life. So I think an argument that says that types of deployments that have higher capital recovery times that licenses match, I don't think is intrinsically wrong. Because we didn't want the PCAST argument wasn't to put people's capital at risk. What it was to create opportunities for the next thing. Is this still the highest and best use if we were channeling a common speaker here? Or is this something that should pass away? So we wanted that turnover, but not for anyone to lose capital. So I think an argument, not just that 3 years or 5 years or 7 years is better, but an argument of this is what it takes to create a certainty for recovery of investment versus a certainty of I'll be here forever is probably not an unreasonable one.
Yeah, and I think we heard earlier there was seemed to be greater openness among speakers here to looking at the terms, probably more so than say the geographic size. But let's get to the audience because we're running out of time and see if there's questions. How about, start all the way in the back since that's where the microphone is, and we'll come up to Patrick.
So if T-Mobile gets the rules changed that they want, are they going to because I look at this basically, I'm looking at the CBRS is very much an in-building technology. So if T-Mobile gets the rule change that they want, are they going to refocus a significant portion of that billions of dollars of infrastructure build every year to build out those in-building systems?
Well, so I can't say what our future plans are, but this is a band that we would look at as coverage and capacity, not just limited to in-building, but in-building and outdoor use. One of our biggest issues on in-building is getting access to buildings, where building owners have agreements with companies that have deployed in a building and we can't get in, or where there are high rates being charged for us to enter that don't make it economic. So we deploy in building all the time and work with building owners, and would love to do more of that.
Yeah, but the demand for in building is increasing, and I get what you're saying, but those situations I think are decreasing, where that's the impediment to getting into a building is the rates that you're being charged by a neutral host. We have owners that are willing to pay for systems, but there's just not the capacity with the carriers right now to provide signal source for every single one of those situations. So if you get your rule change, then and we're focused, and this is very well suited to the in-building space, then it would seem that instead of where it falls now to the enterprise to a large extent to fund these systems, that then the carriers then would take that onus back on themselves.
Look, there's no reason that we don't want in-building coverage. We want in-building coverage. Customers use data, and we want to be able to make sure that they've got the data we need. So to the extent that there are ways to make that happen, we are looking at those.
Patrick has a question here. Oh, here's a mic. Not that he needs it, but go on.
I'm going to agree with you in particular on the LAA front, right? I do think it was silly of WISPs, I know many of which are my customers, that they rejected that. However,
we didn't reject it.
It's an open band, and in fact,
our
company provides the reference design to Intel for their LAA. However, what you may not fully realize what you did in doing that is you just gave props to the concept of a band that enables innovation, whether that's LAA or whether that's LTEU. So you in a way, you help make the argument for more open CBRS.
So, I totally understand the argument, and obviously we are deploying in unlicensed bands. The point was made. We benefit greatly from unlicensed bands. I don't know what the latest numbers are, but I would guess more than 50% of our traffic goes over unlicensed spectrum, right? So we have nothing, we are supportive of unlicensed spectrum, we're supportive of having more of it. When we look at this band, it's a wasted opportunity because it's inefficiently allocated and constructed. It's done in a way that is not going to maximize investment in the band or the technology or deployments, and we just think we've got a much better opportunity to drive a more productive use of the spectrum and in a way that's going to advance 5G development in the country. And that particularly given everything else going on, that there is going to be in the bigger picture of additional mid-band spectrum for both licensed and unlicensed systems, that will be a more efficient way to do it.
Okay, any final question, and then we'll...
Way in the back.
Way back there.
And one up here.
Tell us who you are also.
Okay. I'm Todd Wiggins, and I am a videographer in DC, and I have a generic question. I would like to know if 5G will introduce any kind of more advanced security in the case of some type of attack, because that seems to be a big concern with EMPs and so on. Will there be any effective mitigation of any concerns of electronic pulsing, or any way that it could be more vulnerable or less vulnerable than it is now?
Does anyone know about the security aspects?
It's independent of 5G. It's in your semiconductors. The smaller they get, the more vulnerable they are. Live with it.
I bet if we went around this room, everybody would have a different definition for what 5G is. And I think
But
most
it will
people,
all break.
most people, right? But most people would say it's sort of densified 4G that involves a lot of fixed links. I mean, I don't know that you would disagree with that or not, but that's at a very
It's a different technology, though. I mean, it's some fundamental differences in technology, but
By the time we get there, we'll have redefined LTE to become 5G, just like we redefined pieces of 3G to be 4G.
I think AT&T already did that.
Non-standalone 5G begins the slope of just redefining it.
The security issues will probably be the same. Michael?
Yeah, just a quick question. Given the breadth and heterogeneity of the stakeholders who seem excited about this policy and the spectrum, most of whom are commercial players and understand how to commercialize spectrum and technology and see value add. And given the Commission's 5-0 support for this and a full administrative record, I guess I'm interested in what empirical support you might point us to that supports the idea that the policy is inefficient, that the spectrum is being allocated in an inefficient way, because I think we'd be very interested in looking at it.
mean, we've certainly filed on the record about some of the inefficiencies here, and this has been the whole discussion about the, and the more that we've looked at it, I think it's a fiction that the band is viewed as a partially licensed band. I mean, when you look at licenses that are short-term with no renewal expectancy, that are a decreasing number as years go on because of the way that they're renewed, it was really set up to be an unlicensed band with a nod to some potential for licensed service. And I just don't think it's going to drive the kind of, especially when you're talking, as we look at 5G and you're looking at kind of 40 megahertz wide bandwidths, when you take this band and divide it up into such small segments, it's just not the most efficient way to do it.
So it's fascinating that the carrier view is that it was largely unlicensed. All the unlicensed community walked away from it because they thought it looked like just another thing for the carriers. So, and I think that's the win. That should tell us we did something right. That both sides, the good deal is when neither side likes it. And I think we accomplished that. I would point, if you go read T-Mobile's filing, their comments about efficiency are largely from the point of view of the kinds of deployments they do today. So the other view would be, if I don't have a PAL overhanging me and I go to World Trade Center, I can put 103 copies of networks in each floor, and they'll have 50 dB of isolation and they'll work fine. But if there's a PAL there, I get just one. So efficiency is very much in what is your model of deployment. I can understand T-Mobile, and I wouldn't disagree with their filing from the viewpoint they brought it from. But I think the real challenge we have to give the commission is, do you look at what's there now, or do you look at what could be there in a couple of years if you're going to leave it alone and let it play?
And I would say the policy does not equal efficiency, right? Policy involves a lot of other things. It's a policy that involves, in this case, innovation. It's a policy that involves enabling in-building stuff. It's municipal-driven broadband networks. It's WISP-driven broadband networks, and it's allowing those in other areas to have the same opportunities we do here in D.C. I read a quote in a travel magazine on the plane on the way back that said, D.C. is a city surrounded on all four sides by reality. So I think we need to keep that in mind as we kind of think about the world outside of these four walls and the city here when we kind of think about what is the national policy.
Okay, any final comment from Colleen and Steve, and then we're going to wrap up.
I actually like that quote, and I'll just jump in because I'll tell you the business people and engineering teams that are driving our policy here are not in D.C., and they look at this exactly the same way because they look at that decision and they look at it as a fictional experiment that came out of D.C. to drive policy objectives that won't be achieved with the framework that was put in place.
Well, I'm going to disagree a little because I think our engineers are back there looking at the possibilities in the band, and they do want some minor tweaks, but I think they see a lot of possibilities for the spectrum. So hopefully, using all the testing we're doing and what things we're working on, I think they do think that with some small tweaks we could make it a really successful band.
But they're optimistic out there in reality.
They're outside these four walls, so they must be.
They all look at Washington and like, what the heck is going on there? So.
Yes, no.
Watching this using Wi-Fi out there in the streaming world, you are using something that everyone thought would be an unsuccessful policy experiment. Fact is, if we give people the opportunity to innovate, they shock us with the cool things they can do. If we sit and say, well, it isn't like what we've always done, well, we know where that comes out. But we have seen that if we give people the tools and opportunity, they will find something really cool. And I think we have to keep looking at Wi-Fi, which was a garbage ban. The language that described it in that proceeding is disparaging. And yet look what it became. So I don't believe any engineer can sit and say, oh, no one will ever make good use of this. What that just means is they can't imagine the cool things someone else will think about.
Okay, well, thanks to all of you who hung on for the entire show, and thank the panel.
Good job.